Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're at the bottom, that last line on page 1286, Aleph Resh Pei Vav. Contrasting mitzvahs without b'chol moedecha and mitzvahs with b'chol moedecha. In other words, when you perform mitzvahs, you can do it on different levels. On its own, mitzvahs and Torah, as we learned earlier, are mamshech for sure. Mitzvahs are like kelim, and they draw down divine energy into whatever particular area the mitzvah is being done, whether it's an esrog, whether it's a matzah, whether it's tefillin, whether it's tzitzis, whether it's Shabbos, kashrus, and so on. Everything draws down oir in kelim, which associates with the name Havaya, because the mitzvahs are tluyas and asius of Shemo Havaya we learned. He gave actually 2 examples much earlier. The Yud and the Hey mitzvahs are connected to, where was that? That was here. He said that Krishma is Eis Yud, Tefillin is Eis Hey. And the same with all the mitzvahs. So this associates, because Yud Kei Vav Kei is a gilui of Eir Nakeli. The Oisius of Havaya associate primarily with the mitzvahs. The Eir Havaya primarily with Torah, as we learned earlier. But this is all the binyan hakelim, as he called it, or the tikkun hakelim, the building, the refining, the alignment of the kelim with the Eir, or with existence with its creator. When you infuse mitzvahs now with b'chol moedecha, with the introduction of avarabba, of a great intense love that comes from a neshama, and in the form of b'chol moedecha. Now remember, even a mitzvah, when it's done without that, is also being performed by a neshama beguf. But now you see this, but there you can say the neshama is doing it on a basic level of mitzvahs, even though the neshama is rooted in a higher level. That's what you have to say. But when the neshama now exerts itself to not just do the mitzvah, but to do it with an intense love, avarabba he calls it, and b'chol moedecha, with all of you, not just with your heart, b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, and all your faculties, b'chol moedecha, and all-consuming love, like we learned it, that reaches a level that's higher than Havaya Shemoi. That's who? That's a level where the neshamas are rooted in the very core of the divine, as it is beyond revelation. Like I gave the example, the artist that creates the art, so there's the artist, you see the art, that's for sure Gilui. Even if you see the artist as he relates to the art, that's the root of Gilui, because he's still relating to it. But then what about the artist? What is going on in his deepest part of his heart and soul as he's creating art may never be expressed. He may never tell anyone, and not only he may himself not even have an expression for it. The art is an ultimately expression of his deepest, innermost core essence that is beyond revelation. And that's where neshamas are rooted. And those neshamas, when they do it b'chol moedecha, the introduction of what he calls the hagdomas haveda, like he says, adavka the hagdomas haveda neshama b'chinas avarabba, that reaches that place. And when you draw from there, it's a completely new, unprecedented energy that's not part of Hishtalshlus as in what was created, and even the mocker of Hishtalshlus, and even Torah mitzvahs as it associates with, ultimately with Gilui. And it draws a new energy, and also lamata mata, all the way down below. In the parentheses, he added, as we discussed yesterday more at length, that be'emes, that the hamshachas mitzvahs in their root, in the Ratzon is also through b'chol moedecha, that the mitzvahs themselves are being done that way. That's how I explained it. I still qualify, it could be explained differently, but I read it again and again. It seems to be the only explanation I can come up with, that he's referring now to b'chol moedecha within the mitzvahs themselves, not just as a hagdama, preparing the person being in a state like that, but actually the mitzvahs themselves, b'chol moedecha. But he could, there's the language is very, the language is somewhat not definitive. He says, so I wonder, what does that mean? That b'chol moedecha also draws it down. If you want to have it from the root, the Ratzon Atzmi is through b'chol moedecha, And if the mitzvahs are not done b'chol meidecha, then it's like he says afterwards, below dezeis, it's only the geluyim of seder shtalshus. So on mitzvahs itself, you have the two levels. But then he concludes, however, when you break it down in detail, and be'emek yeser, it's canal as it is before the parentheses, the discussion and explanation that first the neshamas are in a state of aver rabba and chol meidecha, and that is a hagdama to the mitzvahs. So there's the two aspects of it basically, but I think that's the explanation. And then finally, the last thing we learned after the parentheses, the last two lines, and gam. Additionally, going back to the beginning of the point, it's not just that the kelim are drawing down oir as it is with mitzvahs, Torah mitzvahs without b'chol meidecha, but here the kelim themselves kelim the mitzvahs gufa nasim oir. The ein zerak ma shakeli mamshir kim shemer guf va'atzmus hakeli k'may shehir b'sharsha. So as I explained, what he means here is really two things. But they're both part of the same idea. We're not just saying the keli becomes oir, that before the oir, because we said the keli is rooted higher than oir, as we're going to learn right now, and as we learned earlier. So what he's saying is that the keli doesn't just remain a receptacle that channels the oir, it itself becomes a generator of the vine. And what does that mean? Because what radiates is the guva atzmus hakeli k'moishi b'sharsha. So now, without this, the keli is rooted in a higher place than oir, but it's not radiating. Now, through b'chol meidecha, the mitzvah is done b'chol meidecha, the keli itself comes alive, so to speak, in addition to it being a container for the oir. So he's now going to explain this and really bring us back to what we learned earlier about this topic. So I'm going to continue reading now the last two words on this page. So I'm literally on the last line, at the end of the line, page 1286. And if you want to follow the text and you want to have the text, it's at ayinbeis.com. Now he says, ubefrat, and this process of transforming the keli to oir, or in his words, that the meir guva asmas keli kameshi b'sharsha, which I will explain more elaborately, but I want to first read inside how the Rebbe Rashab will explain it. He says, in addition to b'chol meidecha, he says, befrat, specifically, this transformation takes place, and now he's going back and bringing Teshuva into the picture. Because, as we'll soon see, that really finishes, in a sense, is like cements the idea in the fullest sense of the word. So let's read inside, and we'll see why he's bringing this in a moment. Ubefrat, he says, and specifically, al yedei Teshuva ma'aver rabba. So till now, he spoke about aver rabba, intense love, but he didn't say Teshuva. Intense love and b'chol meidecha. Now he says specifically through Teshuva, page 1287, ma'aver rabba. So you may be familiar with that expression from Tanya chapter 7 at the end, which is really from the Gemara in Yuma. So let me just first explain what means Teshuva ma'aver rabba before we read on. So the Gemara in Yuma says that there's a Teshuva ma'aver and there's a Teshuva me'yira. A person who sinned can do Teshuva out of fear of punishment, fear of God. Basically doesn't want to be in a place that is distant. So it's more like surmara. So it says in the Gemara there that Teshuva me'yira impacts mekana lahaba. So you did a sin, so going forth, the Teshuva now corrects it, but you can't correct the past. Because what happened in the past happened. Then there's a Teshuva ma'ava. The Teshuva is not just from fear or concern that you'll be distant from God, or punishment, or however you explain yira, but the Teshuva is from love, that you felt distant, like he says in Tanya. You suddenly feel that you've been so distant, so thirsty, so there's suddenly a surge of love, like a thirsty person really having to have a drink. So the focus here is, yes, it's coming because of distance. It's coming because there was a sin and a transgression. But the Teshuva itself is being driven by a deep passion and love toward God. And the Gemara says there, that is also lemafreya. You can also change the past. That's deinis nasalei kazachis. That even deliberate sins can be turned into merits. Not obviously the sin itself, but the spark within the sin can be redeemed and be transformed into merits. Whereas Teshuva Meira is not only from here on, but also, like he says there, can change Zachis Lishgogis. It's another statement that made there. You can change a deliberate sin as if it was not deliberate, like a non-intentional sin, but not Lishgogis. You can't transform it. By transforming it to merits, that means the past has been transformed. So he's bringing now that when a person does Teshuva Ma'avarabba, Shara Atzmoi Nepach L'Teiv, it's not just that you said, okay, I'm avoiding, I will never sin again. And going forward, the past was the past, I have remorse, regret, and I move forward. But actually, there's a transformation happening. And this is vital, both in understanding this piece and in general, the whole Ein Oid. It's not just you're drawing down energy into a container, you're actually transforming something. You're transforming the Ra itself has been turned to good. That's the inyan that is Dainis. Zodnis from the word mazid. The sins, the deliberate sins, nasim kizachis, become like merits. So it's a very powerful statement. You could say you erase them, but no, he's saying that you transform them. Commission is bar as was explained earlier. Now, where's the commission is bar le'il? The piece on Teshuva, maybe there. He said it there. Just want to see for a moment where he said this. He may have said it a lot earlier, but the place where neshamas are higher than Torah, neshamas are higher than Torah was, where was this? Oh, okay, here we are. I'm looking now at page 1251 and 52 and 53, 1251 through 1253. So he brought the raya, muchachas, that neshamas are higher than Torah from Teshuva. Let me just see. Did he bring Dainis? Yeah. His carbon rakal shegig. Yeah. Okay, there was about carbonas that only on the shegig. Okay. So on page 1253, he brought this idea. I'm just seeing if there's a connection that can help us here. So he says, Osha mechaper al azoden, Teshuva nasim as denis kishgogis, or zakor mechaper. Yeah. In the middle of page 1253, he brings the Tanya actually. And ultimately says that's the mile of neshamas, that's the best proof. Why? Because the fact is the Torah says do something, a person transgressed, so you would think, okay, you can't do anything about it. The fact that a neshama can do tshuva means a neshama is rooted higher than Torah mitzvahs, and it can actually not just correct it, but could also transform it. That was the main point he made there. Okay, good. So befrat through tshuva, so he's connecting it back to those pages. Say dezen nimshach. By doing tshuva in this manner, what are you doing? What are the dynamics behind this? So the dynamics are as follows. Because through this tshuva ma'av rabba, nimshach mizgala b'chinas hela ma'atzmi, the Ein Sof. So just as we learned before about b'chomei dechem mesiris nefesh and so on, it's even more blatant and more obvious when a person does tshuva ma'av rabba. So you have to go higher than giluyim, because Torah and mitzvahs tells you, like it says in the Medrash. This Chassidus brings this. Well, actually, it was brought before in those pages I just read. That when the Eibishter asked Torah, let me just quote this Medrash. I think it'll help us understand this well. So he said the right here. When the Eibishter asked Torah, what do you do? What should a person do who sins? So he says, the Torah says, bring a asham, bring a carbon, and he'll be v'yischaperlei. It'll atone for him. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, yaseh tshuva v'yischaperlei. Hashem said, no, let him do tshuva and he'll be atoned. So what's the difference? Because Torah can only tell you what is right and what is wrong. And if a person sins, Torah doesn't have a solution on its own without Teshuva. Because Torah mitzvahs is like the expression we talk about tzaddikim. Is Adam Yasher Helach. It tells you what to do in a normal situation. So if you ask Torah, if there was no Teshuva and you just ask Torah, what should a person do? A person should live by mitzvahs, avoid sins, and that's that. What happens if he transgresses? So essentially, Torah mitzvahs doesn't have an answer for that because it's out of the realm. Torah mitzvahs is the guide, is the blueprint for life. So this does say in the Medrash that Torah does have a prescription for that, and that's called a korban, which is also an additional element. But the Eibishter introduced another dimension. And obviously Torah also reveals it to us. But it's not Torah on its own level. The level of Torah mitzvahs, as we learned, is Shemo. Havaya. It tells you how to bring Oiris into Kalim in this world, how to make the world a divine home. What happens in a situation where suddenly a person goes off the reservation? And just to put it into context, into the dramatic event, what happened after the Jews built the golden calf, Chet HaEgel? Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu simply open up the Torah and say, okay, let's do Teshuva and we'll take care? He had to march back up on Mount Sinai for 80 days, working hard. 40 days, he wasn't successful. Another 40 days, and comes back on Yom Kippur with Slicha Mechila and forgiveness. Salachti Kidvarecha. What happened? Why did he need all that? Why didn't the Torah give him an antidote? Why didn't he receive at Matan Torah 120 days earlier by Matan Torah that we just are reading this week? Why didn't the Eibishter tell him what to do when there's a sin? Because the Torah on its own can only talk about Giluyim. It could talk about this Giluyim, there's things to do, a korban at best. But Moshe Rabbeinu had to open up a new path, the path called Teshuva. He had to go higher, in the language going higher than Shemo, higher than the way God planned structure of existence. And Torah mitzvahs is above the structure, but it's still teaching the structure how to be aligned with God at the end of the day. So Moshe had to forge a new path. And he went and begged God. I said, I need a deeper power now. They built a golden calf. They transgressed one of the cardinal sin of idolatry, Avodah Zarah, Mamish, the second of the commandments that they had just heard by Matan Torah. So Torah itself, Kav Yochel, doesn't have a solution for that. In a way, you could say, paraphrasing the conversation between the Eibishter and Moshe, why did he need 80 days? Because the Eibishter was telling Moshe, what do you want me to do? I created a world. I gave you an operator's manual, a blueprint. The Torah tells you how to live in this world, what to do and what not to do. Don't put your hand in fire, because when you put your hand in fire, your hand gets burned. When you build a golden calf, there are consequences. It's cause and effect. What do you want me to do? I didn't do this to them. They did it to themselves. What was Moshe's response? Yeah, but you created it all. That's all part of the system you created. I'm asking you to open up a back door to reach deeper. What he's calling here, who? Yecholes of Atzmus. Because I need something deeper. And finally, the Eibishter relents, and Moshe prevails. Salachti kidvarecha. In a sense, Moshe was able to go into a place, into the Yecholes of Atzmus that you don't go to on your own. And that was because of his deep love for God and for the people. And he would not take no for an answer. And he insisted and finally prevailed. That's why Yom Kippur is such a holy day, the holiest day of the year. I'm not going to go into all the details why the Eibishter couldn't do it himself, but there was a need that Moshe had to do it. It had to come from a tremendous, that itself is a form of tshuva. Moshe had to dig deeper and had to beg and beseech God, and the Gilui of Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, the whole Parsha and Parsha Kisisa, which in detail outlined. That's when Moshe asked the Eibishter, actually, show me your face. Show me your face. And God says, I can't show you my face. No person can see my face and live. All that's part of the story that I'm right now recounting. So the bottom line is that Teshuva reaches a deeper place, like he calls it. This This is higher than the whole world of Giluim altogether. He's going into a place of Hela Ma'atzmi, then Shoshazob Shmoi Hakol Batzmusei Mamish. Now I know this will jump, everybody will say, what do you mean, Shmoi? Didn't we say it's who? But this Shmoi he's talking here is not Shmoi that who is Shmoi Bilvad. This is Shmoi Hakol Batzmusei Mamish. This is how it's encompassed completely in Atzmus. She'ein b'chinas hamshachim in Atzmus. It's not even the level of hamshachim in Atzmus. I shall explain this shortly. Kim kol batzmusei b'chinas Yecholes. This is encompassed in Atzmus in a form of Yecholes, his capacity. So you can't say it's Atzmus, because Atzmus is higher than Yecholes too. On the other hand, it's the Yecholes of Atzmus. It's not even any type of transmission altogether. Now this sounds like who, but also sounds somewhat higher than that. But if you remember, he explained who higher than Shmoi in this way as well, that it connects to the Yecholes of Atzmus. If you go back to page 1270. Let me. I'm in the middle of a topic and everyone's into this. Please, let's not ask any questions right now. I have to finish this because this is a very complicated subject. So let me just finish it before any questions. So if you go back to page 1270, he explained because and I'll explain Yecholes shortly more at length, but I just want to finish reading inside. So this is the level of kol batzmus b'chinas Yecholes chulu. Okay. Now, let me explain this, and then we'll read a bit more, and then I'll take questions. So if you recall, we spoke about Ato, Hu, and Havaya, or Ato, Hu, and Shmoi. Now, Atzmus is completely beyond Helam and Gili altogether. You can't call it Helam Atzmi. Hu, or what he's calling now, Shmoi Hakol Batzmusei Mamish, is something that you're calling it something. However, it's like I explained, it's the idea of built to Mitzias Nimtza, already identifying with Mitzias Nimtza. He doesn't use these words here. You could hypothetically say that this is kolol in the built to Mitzias Nimtza of Atzmus. I wouldn't say that. That's not the way I think is the meaning of it. But regardless, it's definitely a level that you can't call being outside of Atzmus, but you also can't call it pure Atzmus. So the way Chassidus calls it, as I mentioned, that Tzemach Tzedek writes in Derech Mitzvosecha, in Sherish Mitzvah Tefillah, he said the Alter Rebbe gave it a name called Yecholes. So it's a word that helps try to identify a level. Remember, God is trying to, in any possible way, give us some way to understand and relate to these highest levels. So Lifnei Tzimtzum in general, we already discussed, is all considered Kol Batzmusei. Everything there is like Kol Batzmusei, because everything is one seamless flow of divine energy. And compared to the after the Tzimtzum, the before the Tzimtzum is Kol Batzmusei. And I've discussed this at length many times. There's a letter from the Rebbe, a very fascinating letter, where someone asked the Rebbe, how could you say levels before the Tzimtzum? And the Rebbe says it's relative to after the Tzimtzum. In other words, the fact that there's no shape or form is relative to after the Tzimtzum. But the Eibishter wanted, as I mentioned yesterday in previous classes, that even in the so-called levels before the Tzimtzum, there should be a semblance of levels. It's not actual levels, it's just conceptual, completely conceptual. But when you go back, we know we've got to the level of Shemoi, but Shemoi, that's already a Gilui La'atzmai, we said, Yud Kei Vav Kei. And the root of that Shemoi, as he's calling it now, Shemoi Kol Batzmus, and what makes it different? Now, we're not talking about a state of any Gilui, we're talking about a state as it's encompassed in Atzmus, and the name for it is called Yecholes, the capacity. So it's the capacity of Atzmus to ultimately be Mamshech Oir, and everything that would come after so-called what is Kol Batzmusei now in this highest level. Now, he doesn't say if this is the level of who, so you could interpret, maybe he will say this shortly, but meanwhile, I would say that you could still say the level of Shmoi, Havaya, Torah, Mitzvahs, the level of who, Neshamis, Hela Ma'atzmi, that's beyond any, even Geder Shaykhis to Makar, the Makar, doesn't even have it's not even in the realm of revelation, completely fundamentally concealed. And you could say that maybe this is a step even higher than that, how it's kol b'atzmus. Or you could say that hu and Shemo kol b'atzmus is the same level. You could really say both when we read it right now. Or you could say, like I say, you could either say that this Shemo kol b'atzmus is even higher than hu, or that's the level of hu. I lean towards the way saying that the Shemo kol is higher, because why doesn't he just say the word hu? But regardless, he calls it definitely Hela Ma'atzmi. He says Hela Ma'atzmi Dein Sof, which is the level of hu. That's clearly the level of hu. And now he calls that the Shemo HaKol B'Atzmusei. Now remember, when you say Hayahu Shemo Bilvad, that he and his name are alone, remember it's God's name. We're not talking about an alien or foreign entity here. It's a name of God. However, God doesn't need a name. A name is only used for someone else to call him by the name. So a name itself implies some form of gili, even la'atzmai. Who doesn't have any form of gili. But still the name is rooted somewhere. The fact that Havaya and the gili oir, even the oir, the highest level of yutke, gili la'atzmai, it's rooted somewhere. She says the Shemo is a kol b'atzmusei. It's not even a shochem in atzmus. Kim kol b'atzmusei b'chinis yecholes. So he's definitely associating this level now with Yecholes, which he already did on page 1270. And now let me just finish the whole point, because what he brings it back to is in his boil il, and it was explained earlier, the yesh lemed the shosh shalakeli, and that's on page 1270. We're talking about now 17 pages back. That the root of the keli is hubchinas hela ma'atzmi, is in the root. Its root is in this core concealed state, the divine power to conceal. Not just the etzema oyer, mahus the atzmus of ein sof. If you recall, that's a higher level than oyer. Now he's going back to the tshuva, and this is drawn and transmitted and revealed al yedei hatshuva hamitis, through true tshuva, shezdenis nasam kizachis, that caused this dainus, the very transgressions, to become merits. And this is mamish, literally a completely new revelation, because it wasn't even a potential state before. Because potentially Torah and Mitzvahs doesn't have this on its own, or the Giluyim don't have it. You must access the deepest levels of the concealment of the divine, all the way to this in the Atzmus Ein Sof, as he calls it, to be able to access this. But let me just read one more line, and then I'm going to stop for questions. This comes from the supernal Eden. Eden Ilah Stima is the key word here. Closed, concealed. This will be the true revelation in the future. And this revelation will come in the gufim, in the kalim, even more in the bodies below, like we learned earlier, and then the guf will actually nurture and nourish the soul. He added that earlier, because it's all about transforming the very keli. So the word keli here, gufim, bodies, or now he's using zdenus kazachis, are all associated, even though keli is not a zodin, God forbid. A container is not a transgression, but the point is they're all going through transformation, not just revelation. You're not just revealing divine energy into a structured existence, the very structure itself, the very body itself, and to the point, even to the point of transgressions, is transformed to lakus, and that can only be when you reach levels that are higher than Giluyim, the level that he's calling here. And to me, it's pretty clear. I think it's the same level. Hela ma'atzmi, Shemo kol b'atzmusei, Yecholes, Behuz v'atzmus ein sof. All these are synonymous when you read this. Okay. Now, a lot of this is brief here because he already elaborated many points earlier on these topics, like I mentioned, 1270 and other pages where he discussed this more at length. So what he added now is that in addition to Ba'ava B'chol Meidecha and Mesiras Nefesh, that causes this higher revelation of this higher level of Helam and Hu, Befrat they had Teshuva. Teshuva has an additional component because it goes even deeper. He doesn't explain the difference between Torah mitzvahs with Ava, Mesiras Nefesh, B'chol Meidecha, and Teshuva, but clearly Teshuva is in the same vein, goes even to a deeper level. Maybe that's why he's introducing Shemo Encompassed Atzmus and by who and Mesiras Nefesh. He didn't mention that, but I don't really want to say that because earlier he did mention it back on 1270. So, but right now it's called a Ubefrat. So that's the way the Rebbe Rasha puts it, that this, what we're talking about, this transformation, reaching all the way this Helam Atzmi, drawing down a new unprecedented energy, drawing it down all the way below, Lamata Mata, without any distinction, and ultimately transforming Keli to Oyer, that it's like in its root, in this highest level, this Ubefrat is through Teshuva, as we just explained and discussed. Okay. Now, go ahead. If anybody wants to ask.
There is a
I just hope that the questions follow what I just said, because I tried to explain it all. And so, go ahead.
Yes, it is. You gave some clarity, but still, there is such a thing, a who Yecholes of Atzmus. You said you don't know, but
I am not going to. You can't speculate. I can't say. I can only say what it says here.
Okay, so why
maybe
why
it could be there. I just say that you can explain it two ways.
Yes,
there's who, and then there's how Shemo Encompassed Atzmus, and that would maybe be who Yecholes of Atzmus. You could say both ways. Let me put it to you this way. Let me say this. There's no question that everything is rooted in Atzmus, and we say the word Yecholes, Yecholte Lahoyer, for example. His capacity to radiate. That would be the root in Yecholes of Gilui. Like in Bosel Legani, Lamata Mata Aden Ketz. Lamata Mata Aden Tachlis. Gilui. That's Yecholte Lahoyer. There's also Yecholte L'Shaloi Lahoyer. He also has the capacity not to radiate, to conceal. That's the root of Lamayla Aden Ketz in Ein Sof, the root of Helam Atzmi and who. So who and Shemo is definitely rooted in the two levels of Yecholes, but it's not two levels because in Yecholes it's all one. It's God's capacity. He has a capacity for everything. So you can definitely say that Yecholes is the highest level. I'm talking about it's not the highest because there's always Atzmus beyond Yecholes, but it's what he calls now Ein Hamshach, as he says, Ein B'chinas Hamshachim in Atzmus. It's all Yecholes within Atzmus. So that's why I said that you could say that who and Shemo are essentially coming from these two types of Yecholes. But when he says it here, he seems to be conflating both of them. And maybe he's just combining it and saying that this level of who is Shemo Encompassed Atzmus, which is the Yecholes. That's why there's not enough information here. If I recall correctly, in Chassidus is discussed in both ways, in different maimorim. But here, he's not yet spelled out. That's why I'm being very, very precise, because there are places where this is more discussed. If you want to see it collected together in Sefer Erchim of Rabbi, the Encyclopedia of Chassidus, in the Erech Ein Sof, he has a whole section on this. What is who, what is Shemo, what is Yecholes, where he brings from many maimorim. And there you see the different ways that it's understood and explained. But the bottom line is, however he's intending here, there's no question that we have these different levels. That's for sure. The question is whether he wants to go into the difference between who outside of Yecholes or not, or he's connecting the two. I would also go back to page 1270 because there he first introduced Yecholes, and you want to really see how he states it there. But there he didn't yet speak the language of who, and he definitely says Yecholes here. I'm going to give Yecholes. 1 second. Helam Atzmi Shemo Encompassed Atzmus. She'ein b'chinas klal b'chinas Yecholes. If you look on 1270, the last lines in the top paragraph, he repeats what he's saying here. He connects the Shosham B'chinas Helam Atzmi. Actually, if you remember there he spoke about Oyer is rooted, he said, in Gilui. He said the Rishimu and Kalim are rooted, he said, in Helam. Then he wrote in Helam. By the way, he did say Hula Mailam B'chinas Shmoi, bottom of 1269. My correction. Helama Eshel Mam B'chinas Gili, Helama Atzmi. He says clearly, Helama Atzmi is B'chinas Shmoi Akol Batzmus. That ain't B'chinas Erklal, B'chinas Yecholes. One minute. He does say levels that he said the level of Helam Atzmi. Okay, I think I clarified it as best as I can right now.
Yeah, you made it much more clear. Is it possible to say that who Hakolol B'Atzmus is Lemailo Meyecholes even? Because Shmoi is Amshacha and who is not any Gilui.
I don't think it says anywhere such a thing, and I don't think you can say that. Because my understanding is Yecholes is the highest thing you can talk about. Beyond Atzmus itself. So I don't think it says anywhere that. But you know what? As I said, you need to look in all the Maimorim. I'm talking from memory right now, my understanding of it. And here for sure he doesn't say anything like that. Here, on the contrary, he says Helama Asmi, which is who, is Shemo Yakol Batzmuse, which is Yecholes. That's what he says here. He says it also on page 1270, very specifically. The only thing I was looking was because I wanted to see, because he did explain it on levels. If you remember, he spoke that it's the Shimu is the Mehusa Shalifni at Simtsum. And then it's Etzema Mamish Helama Eshel B'chinas Pnimius. And then he spoke about Helama Atzmi. He spoke three ways. He spoke three levels of how you explain the root of the Kalim and the root of the Shimu. Remember the Etzem Nekudis HaRishimu.
Not Mahusa Mahusa Kalim.
Etzem Nekudis HaRishimu. Okay, are there any other questions?
Yeah, is this level, this ability to transform the Kalim and the Helam, is this a new way today that we've been introduced? That you can do one through Torah mitzvahs with Abba, Rabba, V'chal Moedecha, and now there's a second way of doing it through Teshuva, Me'ava, Rabba?
I just explained. He uses the word ubefrat. He doesn't say a second way. He said ubefrat because look, what about a person who never did a sin? What about tzaddikim? This is a common question. Tzaddikim, it says when Mashiach also l'sovet tzaddikai b'tiyufta. Tzaddikim who do avodah b'avar rabba and mesiras nefesh, b'chol meidecha reach it, But ubefrat, when a person's, that's like asking a question, does a tzaddik have the mila of a Baal Tshuva? So the answer is, tshuva clearly ubefrat. I don't think it's a second way, it's a befrat. Specifically through tshuva, it's as I said, it's more blatant or more powerful, however you want to explain it. But let's say a person doesn't have his dainus, that still doesn't mean it's off limits. There is, it could have Mesiras Nefesh. A tzaddik could have Mesiras Nefesh just like a Baal Tshuva has, but he's going to have to work harder. Whereas with tshuva, the very catalyst of it all is coming from a very dark place. But that's a classic question everywhere. It's not just here about, what a Rebbe doesn't have the tshuva of Zdeinus Naslei Kazachias. So, and what does it mean? B'mokim shabal tshuva emdim sadikim gemurim ein yechem lamed sham. So there's different ways that we explain it, that you can achieve, just like a person can achieve certain levels by avoiding an avera. But obviously at tshuva, you actually transform. Transformation is always stronger once you've been there. But obviously initially we try to avoid any reason to do a sin. So here he's just saying ubefrat. That's the way I would explain it.
Again, ubefrat meaning in particular.
Right. In other words, in general, we're talking, you do it through Ava, Mesiras Nefesh, B'chol Meidecha, ubefrat, particularly or specifically. Basically, all the bases are covered here. Reaching this level can be done through Ava B'chol Meidecha, and it can be done through Tshuva. Correct. But Tshuva does the same thing that Ava B'chol Meidecha does. It elicits, remember, it's Tshuva Ma'ava Rabba. It's not just Tshuva Me'ira, it's Tshuva Ma'ava Rabba. So it elicits this all-consuming love to God. That's the key. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu did on the mountain. That's what he was achieving. He was reaching this level. But sometimes you come through light, and sometimes you come through darkness. Think of it that way. Okay? Look, let me put it to another way to rephrase the whole thing. A neshama comes down to this world, and the ultimate purpose is this lowest of worlds, right? To make a dir b'tachtein, to make a home for God in tachtein. Now, what does tachtein mean? In Tanya, he says several stages. First, it means that the concealment of the divine is as complete as possible. And higher worlds, there's some revelation. Here, there's no revelation. Then he says the expression, a double darkness. You know what? Let me look inside, because actually there's a sikha Mikates Tov Shemem Zayin, very powerful sikha where the Rebbe spoke about it. I merited to prepare that sikha. So I just want to look there a second, because it just really will capture this that I'm saying. Just give me a second. Let me bring the sefer here. Mem Zayin. Tov Shemem Zayin Mikates. He brings the Tanya. The Tanya is from Perek Lamed Vav. This is Perek Lamed Vav of Tanya. So let me just. If you want to know where I'm looking now. Shabbos Pasha Mikates Tov Shemem Zayin. Very, very, very powerful sikh. So he says like this. Okay, so it's tachten that the oyer is completely concealed. Ad, to the extent, shumole klippes v'sitra achra. Actually, let me read the full version. This physical and crass world, mamish, this is the lowest in level. There's no lower level in the concealment of the divine. So that concealment alone is already going to give room, and it's a breeding ground for things that are far worse than that. Because that concealment was there even in the beginning of creation. Even though it's true, but it was still the lowest of worlds. The Shechina was here, but it was also, the world was a concealed state. There was a tzimtzum and it went through all the ishtalshus. It wasn't as concealed like after the sin, but the fact that God concealed himself creates space and the room for things that are worse. So then he says, ad, shu mole klippes v'sitra achra, to the point that it gets filled with klippes and sitra achra, which wasn't there before Chet Tzadas. So it's the concealment. It's like the classic example. The father hides from his child in order to elicit his ingenuity to find the father. So the tzimtzum is only b'shvil hagili. The whole concealment is in order to find the father. But the father hid himself so well, the child gives up. I can't find him. What happens next? You misunderstand the whole concealment. You think the concealment, my father is no longer here. Since he's no longer here, now maybe I'll do my own. I have my own agenda. Very similar to how the Rambam writes in the beginning of Laws of Avodah Zarah, Yecholes of Atzmus Zarah. How did they suddenly become idol worshippers? Everyone knew there was a God. So he says there that first they felt the God is invisible, so they looked at the stars and said maybe the stars are God's so-called messengers, ambassadors. Then they started giving the stars its own power. Then that was also too up in the heavens. So they built on earth, they built sanctuaries and trees and things associated with this star. Then came the charlatans or whoever and started taking advantage and say, okay, come to my church and I'll tell you how to connect to the stars. Bottom line, it doesn't begin overnight. First is a concealment. Then the concealment leads to worse and worse and worse. The kavanah of the concealment is gilui, is to make it is to bring out the avodah of the yesh and the kalim in this world to follow what Hashem wants. But it could devolve very quickly, as we've seen it has, to a point of filled with klippos and sitra achra. And like he says, shehein neged havaya mamish, they literally are they oppose God to the point that they say aniva af sied. And he actually says all the language. So what do you have from this? What's my point? That the kavanah of dir b'tachtenim is fulfilled even when you don't have to wait for a sin. But once it gets worse, the darkness actually leads to transgression and to turning away from God. So obviously then when you do the Aveda, it's even a deeper level. So the point is, this world, when a person does a sin or does not, is the potential to do a sin. And that's what makes it tachtenim. The concealment of the divine, it gives the potential. In Gan Eden, there's no potential to do sin. There is no other option. All you have is elikus. Only a gili elikus. It's a revealed gili elikus, meaning it's not coming from the etzem. It's only this world that has the yesh hanivra, that that we don't feel we have a source. And all the other things that we talk about, the kalim of this world, that the concealment is that intense, that has the potential. That is why that when you do the ava, you don't just do mitzvahs regular, which is just drawing down the eris and kalim. You do it b'chol meidecha, you're drawing down from the helam atzmi. Teshuva, obviously all this comes to another level because Teshuva actually is tackling the darkest situation. That's not just a concealment, it's also a transgression. So I just wanted to put it into context. That's all really part of the same narrative. Just a question, to what extent? So even if a person today in this world didn't do a sin, the fact is we live in a world, the fact that you don't give into temptation and you avoid doing a sin is also quite an achievement, because this world is very easy to turn away from God. It's not a difficult thing to do. And then the question is, that's why he says it's as a bafrat, because that's where it comes, the whole picture. He's giving us the whole picture of the scenario here. Okay. Just wanted to elaborate on that a bit. Are there any other questions? Okay. So let's see here. So we'll read on a bit. So now he says, "Va'inyan hu." And one more thing to emphasize is la'asad lave. Let's not forget that earlier he was speaking about schar mitzvah b'hai al maleka. So he explained that we have schar mitzvah in this world, but it's still in the level of gilui, not the level of the helam ha'atzmi, as we discussed. So the true gilui schar, like he says, so we still have the mitzvah mem tzadik vav hey, but the gilui of yudke, and the mitzvah, not just mem tzadik, but yudke, and even deeper, the gilui of the helam ha'atzmi that we're talking about here, that will be la'asad lavi, like he just said. That la'asad lavi, all this will be in Nizgala, Eiden Stima, Amitis Agili de la'asad. So he also is tying that together. And that goes back to, I'm reading page 1276, 1277. I was also looking for where he speaks about the body and the soul. Yeah, at the bottom of 1276, he talks about how the body will be nourishing the soul. The keli will be higher than the oyer. And now he's going to tie it back together to something we learned. Just for the record, where at this end of the paragraph, he's tying everything that we've learned for the past pages. He's going to go back to page 1210. 1210. So we're going back now 80, 90 pages. So when we go back to page, if you may recall, if you do recall, on page 1213, he's now going to be connecting what we just learned to page 1213. So he's tying that also together. If you may recall that idea of ani rishon v'ani achron. So he says like this: "Va'inyan hu commotion is bar le'il," and then le'il is page 1213. So it's pretty interesting. 13 here on 87, 1287. So we're talking about 74 pages. So he's referring now 74 pages back, just to show you how the Rebbe Rashab has the whole schematics, the whole scheme of things here. The whole snapshot. So he says, that God says, I am the first and I am the last. So we learned back there that Ani Rishon is the level of Keser. I'm just looking on page 1213. Yeah. Which means higher than Ishtalshlus. That subject, by the way, went from 1213 all the way to 1218. Okay, so he said, Ani Rishon is Keser. Ubesharshehu b'chinas Keser Malchus, the Ein Sof, in its root. It's not just Keser Nishtalshus, but its root is the Keser Malchus of Ein Sof, which means before the Tzimtzum. Oy, Keser HaKloli, which means the all-encompassing, the all-in-general keser, that the desire, the rotzen, kloli of all of existence. Not sure what the difference between keser malchus and keser kloli could be higher than keser malchus of Ein Sof. I think it is. It means the rotzen kloli, right? V'hu b'chinas shmoya atzmi hakol b'atzmus mamish. So in its root, it is Shemo Ha'atzmi that he just said, the core name, as it's encompassed in Atzmus Mamish. And the parentheses he adds, L'fi Mashakosu b'mokam acher. And according to what it says elsewhere, B'inyan, B'chinas Pnimis v'chitzenius shebekeser. where it talks about that there's the inner and outer dimension of Keser, Yesh Shleima B'derech Efsher, we can perhaps say the B'chinas Helam Ha'er Hanal, who bedugmas B'chinas Chetzenius HaKeser. Oh, okay. That the concealed Eir is the outer dimension of Keser. B'chinas Helam Ha'atzmi, who kedugmas B'chinas Pnimius HaKeser. Now, my assumption, Helam Ha'er, he means here, Helam Shel HaGilui. It's concealed, but it relates to the Gilui. And Helam Ha'atzmi is, for example, Pnimius HaKeser. Now, I know this can be quite confusing, because we're talking about Keser now suddenly. We're just talking about levels that are completely higher than everything. So I'll explain it in a moment. I just want to finish reading the next line. V'ani achrein u'b'chinas malchus d'Atzilus. And the second half of the pasuk, I am the last, that's malchus of Atzilus. V'noat seifon b'tchiloson v'tchiloson b'seifon. The end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end. The b'chinas malchus shorsha b'chinas helam ha'atzmi. That malchus is rooted in this helam ha'atzmi, all the way in the Shemo Encompassed Batzmusei. Okay. This is going to need some explanation, so I'm going to stop here because I'm reading on now. I see he's bringing it back all the way to the beginning of this volume where he talked about the moon and the sun. So let me just give one important introduction, and we'll elaborate more tomorrow in the next class. You have to remember always the idea of microcosm, macrocosm. I remember when I first started learning Chassidus seriously, and we're talking now a long time ago. So I remember discussing with one of the mashpim, who was Rabbi Khan, who was received a lot of his learning Chassidus from Rabbi Moshe Gerari, who was a big, from Temchet Mimim, he lived in Tel Aviv. He was considered a big masculine Chassidus. And he told me once that Rabbi Moshe Gerari once was speaking for hours and hours in a Farbrengen between the difference between Chochmah and Bina. Now, Chochmah and Bina are two levels. We all know, we learned about it a lot in Chassidus. Chochmah is the spark of an idea, and Bina is the expansion of the idea, sometimes Ayin and Yesh. But he explained how Chochmah and Bina are really two expressions of the divine. One is the divine as it manifests in the truth of something, and Bina is how we integrate that truth. So there's a sense like Chochmah is like Oyer, and Bina is like Keli in that way. And he connected all the way to the highest levels before the Tzimtzum. And Rabbi El told me that when he was teaching, the Bochum asked him, but we're talking about Chochmah, Bina, and Atzilus. You're not talking about Lifnei Tzimtzum. So he said, everything is everything. Even when you look at a flower or an animal or an object in this world, at the end of the day, it can teach us about different levels of Elokus. And if you go higher and higher, it can teach you about some of the highest levels, because God is embedded everywhere. The only difference is in some things you receive one level, and sometimes it's a different level. So the concept, and this is important to mention, because you see he easily, look how smoothly, without any effort, he goes straight from every these highest levels and right away back to Keser. And we know Keser is already a level. Because the truth is, when we really talk about it in ways that we can understand, we're talking about tangible levels that we can relate to more. The Rebbe Rashab opened up the door to how it is in the highest levels within Atzmus. But the truth is, everything we've been learning about Keser and Malchus and the different levels are really so-called microcosmic expressions of these highest levels. And that's why he uses often this expression, that is B'sharshe. And then sometimes he says, B'shei Sharshe. Because everything is rooted in the highest levels. Nothing suddenly came from nowhere. So you begin by learning things and appreciating them on our level. And then as you slowly grow and strip it from its lower levels, you come to appreciate the essential concepts in the much higher states. So essentially what he's saying here is that Keser is a manifestation of these levels in Atzilus, and it's rooted in these highest levels. So I think it's important to first thing to mention that. And then we're going to learn tomorrow, I'll elaborate more which level is which. But he's going to come to say basically that the Kalim all the way in those lowest levels of Malchus and even lower are rooted in the highest levels of the Shemo Encompassed Atzmus. That's what you have to keep in mind. What he's going to do is tie it together with the ideas he spoke about back in 1210 about Ani Rishon, Ani Achron, Keser, Malchus, the sun, the moon. And he's going to tie it all together in just a few lines, essentially a summation of everything we learned the last 80 pages. And then the next paragraph is going to be going back to page 1210. Actually, 1213 is what I just said. 1213 is where he spoke on Nirashim V'Ani Achron. He's going to go back to 1210, the first topic he started after he finished with Ein Oid. So the truth is, to really understand this page well, this section well, you have to go back to page 12, all the way in the beginning of the Hemshech, and then, which is, not the Hemshech, volume 3, and specifically pages 1207, that's where the volume 3 begins, through 1210, because now he's tying it all together. I'll elaborate on this much more tomorrow, obviously. But just want to tell you where we're going here. So the topic is not finished. We're going to get back to Ein Oid plenty more and more about this. But you could say this is the conclusion of one of the acts of this longer narrative. So there is coming together, he's bringing the ideas together. Okay.
Yeah, Moshe Gorari learned in Lubavitch?
I think so. Not positive, but he definitely learned in one of the Teb Chitmimos in Russia. I think so.
Are you taking any questions?
Whose son was he?
What?
He's asking
Whose son
questions.
was he?
Moshe the Geraris, maybe he wasn't the son of Shmuel Gerari. There were 3 brothers by the Rebbe Rashab, I believe, and the Geraris come from them. There's Moshe Gerari. Moshe Gerari is a brother of Zalman Gerari and Shmerel Gerari. There were 3 brothers.
Abraham, isn't Abraham and his daughter that jumped off that building? Are they related? You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Abraham Gerari, he's Chabad. You didn't hear about his daughter? His big campaigns, big in Brooklyn and Crown Heights.
No. You're talking about somebody that is alive today. We're talking about a person that was...
Yeah, I know, but they could be related, no?
Well, we're all related when you go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the point being is there were 3 brothers, Moshe, Shmerel, and Zalman. Then there's also another family like Nosson Gerari, and he had a brother, Shalom Ber, that lived in South Africa. Nosson Gerari from Montreal is the son of Moshe Gerari. So yes, it's I don't know I remember the whole family structure.
The Ashag was also a relative there.
Correct. It's written up. If you go Lubavitch V'Chayaleha or some of these where they document, I don't remember exactly all the family structure there. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. So not to get caught up with semantics, I'm really not trying to do that here, but when he's talking about Ani Rishon, he says, let's see, we talked about who, where did he say that? Just 1 second. Where did he say that? Oh yeah. He says, "V'hu b'chinas Shemo ha'atzmi haklol ba'atzmus mamash." So here he uses the word Shemo, and he's saying as opposed to who, meaning his name.
Well, I discussed this. I discussed it. He already said it on line 2. Read the end of line 2 on the page.
Okay. Yeah.
So I explained what it means. It's not the Shmoi of who and Shmoi. It's the root of, as it is. It's a higher level. The way it's rooted in Yecholes.
Okay.
Here, and I explained 2 different ways how to understand it earlier in the class. That Shemo Encompassed Atzmus may be the level of who.
Okay. Thank you. It didn't sink in. I heard you say it, but it didn't sink in.
Okay, so we'll stop here listen, this topic I began, but I'm going to go over it again. So don't worry about that. I'm going to go back to the inyan of Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron. I just wanted to put things into context, and we'll discuss it tomorrow more in detail.